Now, while we're on the subject of salaries, let's dive a little bit more into allowances and some options that you have with allowances. Now, the first thing I wanted to go through is that of prorated allowances. And let's just go to Pat's profile and let's add a meal allowance for Pat. And we'll say that this meal allowance starts from June 16th and it's $10,000. So we now have a meal allowance for Pat. Again, it starts from June 16th. I'll go ahead and save. And if you don't have a June payroll for engineering operations team fixed rated, you can go ahead and create that. However, I do have one with Pat for June. And if I recalculate for Pat, we'll see her salary increased, but not by the $10,000 that I added. And why is that so? So if I go to the pay sheet rather, and let's select the non-taxable allowance meal, there we go. Here, we will see that Pat only received $5,000 for June for this allowance. And I will just update my pay sheet format so this allowance gets saved here. All right, so if I go back to Pat's profile, open Pat's profile. Pat, yeah. Again, the allowance is $10,000. However, because it started from June 16th and not from the start of the month, Techlify HR automatically prorates these allowances for you. Right, so it prorates by date. Let's also go ahead and add the same allowance to John. Meal. Again, it starts from June 16th and it's the same $10,000. So if I come back to the payroll here, I recalculate for John. Yep, you'll see John's salary also increases and John has an allowance. However, there's a bit of a difference in John's non-taxable allowance and Pat's. Why is it that John's allowance is $5,077 and Pat is $5,000? Now, what happens is that John works 5 days per week and Pat works 6 days. So what Techlify HR does is that when we're prorating an allowance, it calculates what is the daily rate for this allowance. And of course, Pat's daily rate will be lower because she's working more days. And based on that daily rate and the number of days available within the month, the amount is prorated. Right? So by default, again, Techlify HR prorates allowances for you. Now there is a second option on allowances, and that's to enable absent prorating on an allowance. And what does this mean? When you prorate an allowance for absence, it will Techlify HR rather will deduct an amount from the allowance every time the team member is absent. So again, it calculates the daily rate, and if this team member was absent 2 days for the month, it will deduct 2 days equivalent from the allowance. So let's go ahead and enable absent prorated on John's allowance. All right, and we realize that both John and Pat were absent on June 23rd. So I will go ahead and add an absent day on June 23rd. I'll hit save. That's on John's profile. And you know what? I can do this directly on payroll. So for Pat, I'll add an absent again on June 23rd. I'll hit save. I will recalculate both John and Pat here. Now, if I go back to pay sheet, you will notice, well, firstly, the absent deduction shows up here, and it's 8 hours because both of them work 8 hours days. However, Pat's allowance remained the same, even though she has an absent day, but John's allowance got reduced from $5,077 to $4,615 because John was absent for the 1 day. So that's how the prorating of the allowance work. Absent prorating rather of the allowance. So there's this option in Techlify HR that you're able to say, hey, if this team member is absent for a day, deduct that allowance. And this might be useful for things like meal allowance, where you're giving team member an allowance to buy meals for work, maybe a phone allowance and that type of thing. So if they're absent, of course, they should not receive that allowance. So this is an option on the allowance, and this is how prorating and absent prorating, two concepts that are easy to get confused with. This is how they work, and I hope this gives you an understanding of how we handle these in Techlify HR.